My name's Jake Boston-Kemper, Director of Agronomy and Research for Liqui-Grow.
Hi, I'm Katie Hess, Director of Sales and Marketing here at Liqui-Grow. Jake, we've gotten a lot of phone calls on this topic this week. First off, let's show the folks what we've got. We've got a plant here that is not tasseled and it's not showing any sort of an ear. We have a plant here that has the tassel starting to show and just a little bit of an ear starting to show. And then we have this plant, and these all came out of the same row, Jake.
Within
this one's
10 feet of one another.
Throwing some pollen, and it's also starting to pollinate. So what does this mean for our corn crop, the unevenness that we're seeing out here in these plants?
Let's back up and talk about the factors that have led up to this first, okay? So, you know, yeah, we're seeing this all over eastern Iowa. I haven't physically been up in north central Iowa or northwest Illinois in the last couple of days, so I'm not sure if it's across the entire geography, but it's sure showing up hardcore in eastern Iowa. And so when I think back about the growing season we've experienced thus far, I think about three core things that could be causing this, okay? And I'm going to start with some contributing factors, and I'm going to talk about the main factors. So the contributing factors are, let's think back to what happened in early April. We had that big wind event, we had a lot of dry residue, we had residue blowing and piling up in places, okay? So because we had that residue laying on top of the soil surface, in some areas, that's definitely caused some uneven emergence, okay? The second thing is we had a historical dry April and May, and we had dry soils at planting. And because we had dry soils, we had variation in soil moisture across the field. And that led to generally more uneven emergence than we like to see, okay, in general.
Sure.
The third factor, and most important factor in my opinion, is because of the extremely dry soils, that led to some pretty extreme differences in access to water and access to nutrients, okay?
And if you want to learn more about that, check out our last couple of videos.
And that's really important though, because you know, you think back to starter fertilizer, and what do we see with starter fertilizer? Oftentimes we see with starter fertilizer that the corn tassels, you know, up to 2-3 days, a week earlier than corn that didn't have starter fertilizer. And that's because that starter fertilizer gave quick access to those nutrients, and that crop is physiologically ahead of the corn that didn't get starter fertilizer. And that's the same kind of thing we're seeing out in these fields. So some of these plants, for whatever reason, had better access to water and nutrients, and they're physiologically ahead of their neighbors.
Okay, Jake, so we're to this point now where we're seeing the unevenness. How long will these plants throw pollen to pollinate these silks?
They'll throw pollen for a couple weeks. Enough pollen's not the concern. What you really need to be looking at is you need to be looking at, when I have the tassels out, do I also have the silks out? You want to be looking for that delayed silking is what you want to be looking at. So if you're at hard pollen shed and there's no silk present, you know, that should be a little bit alarming. I don't expect a lot of that, but you know, do look out for that. So if you're shedding pollen hard and there's not a lot of silks out, you know, that is somewhat alarming. But I don't expect to see a lot of that. But your original question was, what's this going to do to yield? Unfortunately, I do think that this uneven tassel emergence we're seeing is a sign of, you know, some factors that led to uneven plant development. And I do think that that's not a great sign for yield. I don't think it's a disaster by any means, but I do think it's not a good sign regarding evenness in emergence and evenness in plant development. And, you know, that could set us back a little bit.
You know, we don't usually start looking at ear counts until mid-August. You think of the different farm tours that happen throughout the United States. Can we start looking at stuff earlier and get a good gauge on what yield could look like?
Not necessarily, Katie, because if we have good seed set, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to hold on to all those seeds, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, you really aren't going to have a good idea until, you know, we get into dent or so. That's usually by the time you get to dough, kind of that first denting stage. At that point, all those kernels are going to stay there. But until that point, you could have some kernel abortion, and you're just not going to have a good idea of what you're going to have until another month down the road.
Well, thanks, Jake, for being here with us today, and hope everybody's having a great day.
Stay in the know with Liqui-Grow.